We're here today to talk about how to sew elastic and ribbons onto your brand new pointe shoes. In order to do this, you will need several things. You'll need your new pointe shoes. You'll need 1 or 2 pieces of elastic. You'll need ribbons for your pointe shoes. These can be either elastic stretch ribbons, basic satin ribbons, or the satin ribbons with the elastic sewn into them at the ankle. You'll also need a thimble, a needle. I recommend a thick needle for sewing your pointe shoes. You'll need some push pins or safety pins. You'll need thread, pink thread, or thread that matches your pointe shoes. You can also use thread that comes in the stitch kits or dental floss. You'll need a pencil, and you'll need a pair of scissors. So first I'm going to teach you where to position your elastic. So in your pointe shoe, you're going to take your pointe shoe and put 3 finger widths at the back of the pointe shoe. You're going to sew your elastic on either side of your fingers. So you're going to take the first piece of elastic and sew it on the outside of your shoe. I'm doing this for people who have brand new pointe shoes. So you're going to be sewing onto the outside of your shoe for these pointe shoes. For those who are more advanced in their pointe shoe work, or in your pointe work, you can sew your elastic into the inside of the shoe. It's basically the same, it's just the positioning is the same, it's just determining whether or not you're going to sew on the outside or the inside. So for sewing on the outside, I mark with my fingers where 3 finger lengths is. I'm not going to mark the shoe because I have a marker based on the sewing of the shoe because of the block European balance. These shoes give you a good placement mark in the manufacturing of the shoe. But you can use a pencil and mark your shoe lightly if necessary. So you're going to place the elastic on the outside of your shoe and leave about a 1/2 inch to 1 inch below the casing. I'm going to pin this in place using a straight pin. And once in place, we'll take my needle and thread, and I'm going to sew back and forth across the elastic underneath the casing. I don't want to sew on top of the casing because I don't want to risk locking the ribbon in place and not being able to use it to adjust my pointe shoe later on. The other thing you want to remember is to loop your sewing needle with your thread onto the outside of your elastic on either side, straight into the pointe shoe, so that you're really locking that ribbon into place on the pointe shoe. So you're going to go back and forth a zillion times. Once that is complete, it'll look something like this. So these are a brand new pair of shoes that I sewed the elastic on the inside onto. As you can see, I went back and forth several times. I did not sew down the ends of my elastic. You are certainly welcome to do that if you'd like to. I'm too lazy, so I just sew across the side or across the length of the elastic to lock it in place. And if I pull on this, it's really snug and in place and it's not going anywhere. And I've locked in the outsides of the elastic by stitching past and then back through on either side, so that elastic's not coming up on the sides either. And again, if you'd like to, you can certainly sew the ends of this elastic down. Make sure that you leave, again, about a 1/2 inch to 1 inch in length at the bottom of your elastic so that it does not fray and rip right out of your stitching as you dance in them. Once you have one side of your elastic in place, you're going to put the pointe shoe on your foot. I'm going to use my left foot so that this is on the outside. That'll make it a lot easier for me to measure. And you take the elastic. I would recommend doing this without socks. You take the elastic around your ankle and you measure where you're going to put it on the opposite or on the inside of your foot. So I want this to be snug, not cutting off circulation, and not loose where I can fit space in between the elastic. Nice and snug. And I'm going to take my pencil on this and put a little mark onto the elastic where I need to sew it on the outside of my shoe. Don't worry about the mark that you make. You will not be seeing it from stage and you'll be sewing right across it, so it's okay. Make the mark so that you can see it and then sew across it. Now I take this shoe off my foot and I get my needle and thread, put this in place, and sew back and forth another gazillion times to lock this piece of elastic in place as well. Before I do that, however, I want to make sure that my very long elastic, that I cut it into two pieces. So I'm going to take my elastic, put the ends together, and measure it, and then I'm going to cut it into two pieces so that I have two pieces of elastic, one for each shoe. And then I'll find my measurement mark again and sew it in place. Now, as you can see, I'm holding this piece of elastic slightly at an angle. I like to angle my elastic just slightly so that it fits my foot better and I don't get any bulkiness in the elastic when I put it on my foot. You are more than welcome to do that, but if this is a little bit too complicated, just put the elastic in place and sew it straight up and down. You'll be just fine doing it that way. And once you have that all sewn and in place, you'll have a shoe that looks like this with your elastic sewn on either side, and it will be looped in the center so that when it's all said and done, you have a nice elastic loop for your foot to hold that shoe onto your foot. Now, if you happen to be somebody who likes to have double elastics on their shoe, crisscrossing them very similar to how you would have it on a pair of ballet slippers, that's certainly fine. In this case, you're going to sew one piece of elastic in place. You're going to put the pointe shoe onto your foot, bring the elastic across, and instead of sewing it back by the ankle, you're going to sew the elastic up at your arch where you would typically find the elastic on your ballet slippers. I'm going to pull, for me, I would recommend pulling it back slightly, not quite all the way back to the back of your foot, but back slightly so that it's past my arch, because I really want to hold this shoe on my foot and make sure that it's nice and snug. In this case, I'll mark this spot and sew it back and forth. So now I have an elastic on the shoe that is slightly off-centered. So it's 3 finger lengths on this side from the back center, but it's further forward on the opposite side because I'm going to crisscross. And then I'm going to take my second piece of elastic. I'm going to mark this in place to hold it. I'm going to take my second piece of elastic, sew it at the back of my shoe, just like I did on the opposite side, put the shoe on my foot, loop it across, mark it on the outside, and sew it in place so that I now have 2 pieces of elastic on my pointe shoe. They crisscross, and when I put my foot in, I've got a lot of security on my shoe now. This is good for people who have pointe shoes that tend to slip off their heel, pointe shoes that twist just slightly on their foot, or anybody who just wants a little bit more elastic support in their pointe shoe. All right, so that is how you sew the elastic. I would highly recommend when you sew that you use a thimble and take your time when you do your sewing. It's not a fast process and you want to make sure that things are nice and secure and you're not rushing. You don't want a pointe shoe with elastic that's going to slip and slide all over the place and not secure the shoe to your foot. You want to make sure that you can take that point shoe and the elastic and yank on it real good and make sure that that elastic isn't ever going to go anywhere. So take your time when you sew back and forth. Again, there's a lot of stitching on just one side of the elastic shoe, and your thimble will help save your fingers as you do this. All right, then we move on to sewing our ribbons. So I'm going to use this other shoe as the sample for sewing my ribbons. Ribbons typically come in a really long roll, and you need 4 ribbons for your point shoes. So we're going to take this length of ribbon, roll it all out. Again, this is the elasticized ribbon, which is perfectly fine to use, or you can use the standard satin ribbon or the ribbon that has a bit of elastic sewn into the satin. So I'm going to take the length of this ribbon and I'm going to cut it in half with my scissors. This gives me 2 pieces, but I need 4, so I'm going to take them again and cut this in half. And then I'm going to do the same thing again with the other piece of ribbon. All right, so we're going to take this ribbon. Before I move on, make sure that you ask your point instructor what type of ribbon you should be using. She or he may want something standardized for the entire class or the entire studio, or it may be individualized to your needs. So make sure you're asking questions before you purchase your ribbon. All right, so I'm going to take this ribbon. You can also burn the edges slightly. Make sure you have an adult present to assist with that, just so that they don't fray. But the way I do my ribbons when I sew them, I pretty much eliminate that problem. So I'm going to fold this ribbon. First, I'm going to determine which is the shiny side and which is the matte side of the ribbon. The shiny side goes out towards the audience because it's prettier. The matte side goes against your skin. So I'm going to take the matte side up, I'm going to fold this in, and then I'm going to fold it one more time to tuck the end of that ribbon to the inside. This is what we're going to put onto the inside of the shoe. In order to determine where your your ribbon goes on your shoes, it's a good idea to put this shoe on your foot, point your toe in it, and find the height of your arch. So my feet, I don't have a huge arch in them, but I can feel with my hand that my arch is right about here. So this is where I'm going to sew my ribbons. And in this particular pair of point shoes, it just so happens that that's almost where the seam of the point shoe falls. I don't want to sew on top of that if I can avoid it. It's really difficult to sew on top of all of this stitching. So I'm going to go just in front of this. I might have to sew a little bit on top of it in the corner, but I'm going to try and avoid that. My ribbons, I'm going to position them so that they are underneath the casing, but not straight up and down. That's going to be difficult when you go to tie your point shoes if you sew your ribbons in straight up and down. You want to angle them slightly forward and sew them at an angle. That'll help when you tie your point shoes. So I'm going to pin this into place once I have it positioned. I'm going to go ahead and put this shoe back on my foot, being careful not to stick myself with the pin, and make sure that it's where I want it. And in this case, I think I've put it too far forward. So I'm going to reposition it and try and get it behind this stitching and see if that works better for me. Again, it's okay if you put your ribbons right on top of that seam. Just know that trying to sew on top of that is something of a nightmare. So if you can avoid it, I would recommend it. So I'm pinning this in again behind that seam to see if this works better for me. Still at a slight angle forward so that it makes it easier for me to tie these when I put them on. And I like that, so that's what we're going to do right there. So as you can see, you have a nice little rectangle or square shape here. So you're going to take your needle and thread and you're going to sew across about 3 or 4 times just across the top of this little box. And then you're going to sew down, across, and up to lock the entire ribbon in place. You only need to do that down, across, and up once or twice because you're just trying to put it into position so it doesn't move around. And then I'm going to go across the top again 3 or 4 times to make sure that ribbon is very snug and it's not moving around at all. So when you're finished with that, you'll have ribbons that look something like this. So a nice little box around my point shoe ribbons. And on this shoe, I took a lot of time when I sewed this one. I even did the effort of not sewing through the shoe on the box that I did around. So when I did the top, I sewed all the way through the shoe, down onto the other side through the satin, and then back. And I did that across many times. However, when I did the sides to lock them in place, I took the time to only go through the lining of the shoe. I didn't go all the way through to the satin so that you don't see that on the outside of the shoe. You just see the top. It makes it a little cleaner, a little nicer, prettier to look at on stage. But it takes a lot of effort. So think about it before you take the effort to go through only the lining. Think about how much time you want to take on your point shoes sewing them. If these are your first pair of point shoes, just sew down through the satin and back up again. It's perfectly fine, and it'll help put them in place nicely. Now your ribbons always go on the inside of your point shoes as opposed to the elastic, which sometimes goes onto the outside. So you're always sewing the ribbons onto the inside. And when you do that, you want to make sure that you're sewing as close to the casing as possible at a slight angle without sewing on top of the casing, so that your shoes, you're not locking the ribbon or the tie in place. And your shoes, you're able to secure them onto your foot nicely at the top of the shoe instead of sewing way down into the shoe, and then you would have a lot of looseness up here. We don't want that. All right, so once you sew one side, you move on, repeat the process. Sew the other side of the shoe in exactly the same positioning as you did with this ribbon. And then you're going to move on and do the same thing with shoe number 2. And when you're all finished, you'll have 2 point shoes, both with elastic sewn into them and ribbons sewn into them. And then at that point in time, you'll take your ties and tighten them up as much as you need to if necessary and tie these into place so that the shoe stays securely onto your foot. Don't tighten these in advance of sewing your ribbons. It'll make things very difficult for you when you're trying to sew because it'll be bunched up and taut, and you don't want that. All right, so this is the end product after you sew your point shoes.